Imagine being the Seoul Dynasty in Season 1 of the Overwatch League. Don't you feel awful? Seriously, is there any other team who had it worse? Sure, Shanghai and Florida, they sucked, but at least we kind of knew it was going to happen. Seoul went into Season 1 of Overwatch League as everyone's favorite to win. How could you not go with these guys when they picked up Lunatic Hai? This is the only team to win multiple seasons of Apex, and Apex has only been around for 4 seasons. Players like Ryu Jae-hong, Toby, Miro, and Zunba are all extraordinary talents. They change the way people think about how they play certain heroes. How could this team not be one of, if not the best team in the world? Well, they weren't. While the aforementioned were the best in the world just months before, part of being the best is that everyone wants to pass you. So they study your every move, learning your secrets, and then they improve on them. Not only were the Seoul Dynasty not the best team in the league, but they didn't even make the playoffs, including any stage playoffs. The only other teams in this club were the Shock, the Mayhem, and the Dragons. Needless to say, the Seoul Dynasty were the most disappointing overall franchise in Season 1. Now, with Season 2 on the horizon, all Seoul could do was try to pick up the pieces and start building an actual dynasty. Let's see how they did. Most people agreed that Seoul's biggest problem in Season 1 was what became dubbed as the too many cooks in the kitchen syndrome. That is, Seoul had a massive 5-man coaching staff. And while there was an incredible amount of talent on the roster, there were so many different opinions of how to use that talent that, in the end, the Dynasty didn't end up doing much of anything. In fact, with each game that went by in the season, they looked more and more unsure of themselves. So, a restructuring of the staff was in order, and boy did they start chopping heads. Beast, Always Suv, Nugget, and Bubbly were all released from the team. The only survivor, Hokrai, moved into a general manager role, tasked with rebuilding the coaching staff, and he would choose a much more reasonable 3-person setup. Their assistant coach, Cheng-gun, probably sounds familiar to you because he spent Season 1 with the London Spitfire as they took home the Season 1 title, so if you can get him, it's a pretty obvious choice. Their other assistant coach, Why Not, was the coach of a pretty successful O2 Ardeont team, so no surprise there either. Their head coach, though, was a newbie by the name of KDG. KDG joined Seoul after coaching for a European contenders team called Snakes. This is a team that had come out of nowhere in Europe to compete with the best teams that European contenders had to offer, so obviously he was doing something right. And he must have really impressed in whatever interview or tryout that Seoul had him do. So, with the new coaching situation taken care of, it's time to deal with this roster. Seoul's off-season was pretty messy, so we'll start by talking about all the players that they dropped, move into the players they kept, and finally, the pickups. The Fallen. Gambler retired from competitive Overwatch as soon as he left the team. Gambler was probably one of the best pickups for Seoul in Season 1. He filled the Mercy role well when Toby was struggling, ending his career on a respectable note. He would go on to become an official streamer for the Dynasty's parent company, Gen.G. The same would go for Miro. The once legendary Winston player had unfortunately lost his touch on the stage, but you'll still occasionally see him on the sidelines cheering for the team during special events. Wakid and Guido, while showing flashes of potential, often ended up on the bench in Season 1, and Seoul just saw no use for them anymore. Wakid would eventually end up on the Dynasty's Academy team, while Guido would look for redemption on the Washington Justice. Zephyr, the Scrim God himself, would find himself a starting off-tank spot on the Florida Mayhem. Would he be able to clear the memes off his name? Finally, Kuki left for the LA Valiant. He had a lot of experience on main tank. While he probably wouldn't start over Fate, he's still a solid backup on main tank, and there's no way that he would be playing anything other than main tank. The Survivors. Ryu Jae-hong, Toby, and Zunba were all that remained of the legendary Lunatic Hai squad that once dominated the scene. There was no questioning that these guys had talent, The only question was if that talent could be rekindled with the right teammates and support staff. Munchkin and Fleta were the two who ended up being the DPS duo for Seoul in Season 1. No one would deny Fleta's talent. Fleta is the meta after all. His flexibility and mastery of so many heroes makes him a threat no matter what team he's on. But the issue is, once other teams caught on to this, everyone just committed a lot of resources to shut him down, and Seoul couldn't do anything about it. Munchkin definitely played second fiddle to that, but he played a much more team-oriented playstyle that I'm sure the Dynasty enjoyed and wanted to keep. The newcomers. The tank line of Marvel and Michelle was brought in from Lucky Future Zenith, the Korean team that had been dominating Chinese contenders up to this point. While they weren't the most high-profile pickups, they sure had proven their worth at a tier 2 level. Jexay was a high-profile pickup. The Element Mystic main support was viewed as one of the best at his position that wasn't in Overwatch League, maybe even of those who were in Overwatch League, and was considered a huge benefit for this team. Fitz is a very interesting case, being picked up from Contenders Korea Trials as a member of Go and Water S. He didn't have much experience at the highest levels, but you gotta give Seoul props for taking a chance on an unproven player. And of course, you can't forget the most handsome main tank himself, Fissure. Known as the man who single-handedly took the LA Gladiators from pretender to contender before pulling himself out of the roster right before playoffs for some petty reason. Fissure had loads of talent, was one of the best main tanks in the world, and his aggressive playstyle is crazy fun to watch, but he also demands a lot of the team's resources, and seems to have a bit of a temper to boot. Hopefully, getting on his dream team with some of his dream players and not having to deal with any language barriers would make sure this season would be drama-free. With Season 2 around the corner, most people liked how the Dynasty were looking. They seemed to have fixed their coaching issue, kept the most important parts of their Lunatic Hai core, and added in a good mix of high-profile and under-the-radar free agents to build around them. This is why most analysts had Seoul in the top half of the league in their power rankings. But after the monumental disappointment that was Season 1, no one was ready to fully commit to the Dynasty just yet. They would have to prove it on the stage. So let's talk about the starting lineup that Seoul would showcase for most of Stage 1. We had high-profile free agents Fissure and Jexay. Michelle had the starting off-tank role over Zunba, while Fleta, Munchkin, and Jaehong would be returning to their starting slots. At the time, this seemed like the best combination of players that Seoul could put together, and they seemed legitimately scary. Stage 1 was looking pretty tough though, with games against the Gladiator, Spitfire, and NYXL on the schedule, but they managed to stay competitive. Here's what I'll say about the schedule. All the teams that Seoul lost to ended up in the Stage 1 playoffs. The ones they beat, they ended up watching at home. To start off the season, the Dynasty had a crazy aggressive style of goats, probably to supplement Fissure and his solo carry playstyle on Rhine. A very high-risk, high-reward playstyle that I think led to some confusion and even disagreements within the teams at times. But that's not to say there wasn't a lot to like. When Fissure's playstyle worked, it worked, and he would take over his games. In addition, Michelle, of all people, ended up being a highlight player. Michelle was one of the first and most prominent examples of the off-tank Sombra, playing a very good diva when Seoul wanted to run pure GOATS comps, but also being very lethal when he swapped onto the Hacker. This gave Seoul a measure of flexibility in their comps early, which would catch some teams off guard.
Here we go, Houston Outlaws finally with some ultimates to use as they go in minefield used by Muma. Can they pick anybody off with it? Oh, Rock as he gets his Dragon Strike eaten by Michelle, and Michelle eats the Pulse Bomb as well! Whoa!
Oh no! I mean, this could be it right here.
Off the seat of the ground, knocks him out, that's gonna be a hack on Jonik, as you say in the back, he can't use a Transcendence, he has to lift him, it comes in late, Becko's trying to stay in the suit, we'll be able to...
The fact that he actually got the old off in itself is pretty amazing, but there it is! Dallas getting impeded as well, and lights out Dallas! Seoul Dynasty.
Punch, will get moved back, Meteor Strike's ready to go, and everyone's just kind of bottled up on the stairwell, drops down and Fitz fights a triple kill, oh boy, knocks him out of the park!
Seoul would finish Stage 1 with a record of 4-3. This was good enough to qualify them for the stage playoffs, officially ending the drought. I'm honestly really glad that they ended it so early so they wouldn't have that monkey on their backs as the season progressed. But they were entering the playoffs as a lowly 7th seed, and of course the NYXL were waiting for them. NYXL had gone a perfect 7-0 this stage, looking clean, sharp, and sure of themselves in this meta. AKA, everything that the Dynasty weren't. No one thought that Seoul would be able to take them down. In fact, most people were already preparing for the inevitable finals of NYXL versus the Titans. But Seoul walked onto the stage that day with a completely different look. Fissure, the supposed kingpin of the team, he was out from Marvel. Zunba came in for Michelle, and Toby for Jexay, completing the Lunatic Hai trifecta with Jaehong, and finally Fitz was in for Munchkin, but Fitz played Zarya while Fleta was on break. What are they doing? Everyone thought, including myself. Why are they shooting themselves in the foot by putting the B team in on such an important match? Well, as it turned out, this wasn't the B team, it was just a different team. With this new lineup, Seoul played a much slower playstyle, which I don't think NYXL were expecting. They got rattled early on and couldn't recover for the rest of Ilios, leading to an easy-looking 2-0. After that map, Seoul swapped back to their main lineup, and they proceeded to dismantle NYXL through their Sombra Goats. Fissure destroyed Mono. Jaehong outperformed Jonak. It was like 2017 all over again.
Further behind the grab, not there for Fleta. They can still make this work, but it's going to be in overtime. As they work their way forward. What was that? He eats it on the inside. It doesn't do jack. Meko throws a bomb to the back of this play, trying to find something. Finally, EMP comes in. The shatter's absolutely huge. Jonak trying to keep him alive, and now gets picked in the Seoul Dynasty. Now the answering grab comes through. OT going to be ticking down, and they've actually done it.
While Seoul would end up falling to the Titans in the semifinals, this game put them on everyone's radar. Not only did the Dynasty have their first playoffs, they had their first playoff win. And just like that, a message was sent to the rest of the league. We are here. Don't underestimate us. Now, near the end of Stage 1, Seoul actually signed 2 more players to their roster to fill out at 12. You had Illicit, a flex DPS player from Blossom, and Highly, a flex support from O2. Now, you may notice that with these additions, Seoul has 2 basically complete teams, with 2 players at every position. While these 2 wouldn't join the team for a few months because visas, this is completely purposeful. Now, if Stage 1 was tough for the Dynasty, Stage 2 was a gauntlet. No one wants to be facing Vancouver twice in one stage, let alone adding Hangzhou and the Gladiators on top of that. Sure, there were a few winnable games in there, but to make the playoffs again, Seoul would have to pull off some quality wins. This is when the secret weapon of the Dynasty came into play, their roster flexibility. Stage 2 started, and everything was the same, except for Fitz, who had the starting spot over Fleta. But in the next game, Fleta was back. A game after that, and everything went crazy with Toby, Marvel, and Fitz in the game, and this would go on throughout the stage and a lot of the season. You would rarely see the Dynasty playing the same roster 2 games in a row, and their roster changes made almost no sense. There was no way to predict it. But I think that was the point. By having 10, and soon to be 12, players on a roster that was constantly changing, opposing teams would have a near endless variety of combinations to prepare for, which left a terrible dilemma of trying to predict the roster and looking stupid when you get it wrong, or preparing a little bit for every possibility, making you in the end unprepared for any possibility. A strategy like this had been tried in Season 1 by the London Spitfire, but it mostly failed because people wanted starting spots, and London was eventually forced to cut almost everyone except for their starting 6. Seoul was the first team to find any success with this strategy. However, that doesn't mean there wasn't any discourse. I get the feeling that Fissure was promised the starting spot on Seoul, so when he started sharing time with Marvel, he became more irritable. There were rumors that Fissure and Jexay were fighting for control of the team in the leader position in-game, which may have been part of why the roster carousel started. And of course, it's going to take a little longer for a fluid 12-man roster that gelled together than a rigid 6-man roster. Combine that with the aforementioned brutal schedule, and Seoul would finish 3-4 this stage, unfortunately missing out on the playoffs.
And they're the ones with the ult advantage now on the side of the Spark. They can just go ahead and chuck these guys off the bridge into the drink. Rallies in, there's the stun.
Oh!
Yep, sure enough, Ben. What are you gonna do now, buddy? What are you doing now, buddy? See ya! Unreal! Wait, hold on, he can jump out of the boat. Fitz, don't miss this chance! Oh, he misses the chance! He's just gonna wait and come back around.
Oh my
He's
God.
still.
Oh, he does himself in.
With Stage 3 continued the crazy roster rotations, except for one thing, Marvel. He had been splitting time with Fissure for a while, but all of a sudden, he took the starting main tank role entirely. Maybe they preferred his more team-oriented style, or maybe they liked his synergy with Michelle. I don't know, but like clockwork, a few weeks into the stage, Fissure left the team and retired from professional Overwatch. He would always be known as one of the most talented and entertaining main tanks that ever played the game, but on the other side, often problematic, becoming petty and short-tempered whenever he didn't get his way on a team. Alas, he was gone now, and there was no possible way that he would ever return to playing in the Overwatch League. Anyways, Seoul continued their daily rotations, and the team seemed to come together a lot more. Maybe it was due to a much more forgiving schedule, but Seoul started gelling together, incorporating new arrivals Illicit and Highly into the roster pretty quickly, all things considered. Their only losses this stage would come against the dominant Shock and the Spark, and that Spark game could have easily gone either way. Seoul finished the stage as the 5th overall seed after going 5-2, qualifying for their second stage playoff of the year. Unfortunately, they would get bumped out unceremoniously by the Shock, but for the moment at least, Seoul seemed to have a lot of their issues figured out. They had a nice 12-9 record going into the final stage, putting them in good position for the overall playoffs, and for the first time, looked strong as a unit instead of a bunch of individuals. This gave fans plenty of reason for optimism going into the final stage. Between stages 3 and 4, we learned that Munchkin was going to be moved to the team's inactive roster while he took a break from competitive Overwatch. And then, a week later, he left the team entirely. This move caused concern, as this was the second time that a player had left the team in a month. Not traded, not transferred, they just left. Not many people were questioning Seoul when the somewhat volatile Fissure quit the team, but the calm and collected Munchkin? Was there something going on under the surface that was causing Seoul to burn out faster than other teams? Maybe it was the burnout, or maybe it was the meta change that came with Roll-Lock, but the Dynasty took a few steps back this stage. They actually took a step back from the wild roster changes as a whole and became a lot more static. For the most part, Marvel, Michelle, Jaehong, and Illicit held onto their starting spots, while Fleta would share time with Fitz and Toby with Jexay. But Seoul still struggled. They gave Shanghai their only win of the stage. They dropped winnable games against the Charge and Diffusion, and of course, they lost to the Shock for the 4th time this year. Even the wins that they got, it wasn't pretty. 2 out of the 3 of them were decided by one map. So after a rough 3 and 4 stage led the Dynasty to a 15 and 13 overall record, they limped rather than sprinted into the playoffs as seed number 8. Luckily, as the 8th seed, Seoul was able to skip past the first round of the play-in bracket and found themselves facing down the Guangzhou Charge for a full playoff spot. Guangzhou was getting hot at just the right time, going 6-1 in Stage 4, and was coming off of a convincing win over the Chengdu Hunters. Most people favored the Charge here, but Seoul proved why you couldn't count them out. Nero's Pharah, which destroyed the Hunters a game before, was utterly shut down by Fleta's McCree. Marvel picked up the new hero Sigma and pulled off some incredible stuff, especially with his accretion ability, not to mention Fitz came out of nowhere on Doomfist. So yeah, Seoul won this match pretty effortlessly. But then it came time for the real bracket. See, all season, Dynasty had been viewed as kind of gatekeepers to the top portion of the league. If you could beat them, then you could compete with the best. Lose, and you had a lot of work to do. Seoul had struggled to replicate what happened in the Season 1 playoffs, but now had to be the time. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. Seoul was forced to go up against the Titans in round 1, where they put up a good fight, winning 2 maps, but it just wasn't enough. In the losers bracket, they then got bounced out by an extremely determined Spark in 5 maps, and just like that, Seoul's season was over. What followed their elimination was probably the most emotional moment all season, where, in a post-game interview, a tearful Jaehong and Toby apologized to their fans for failing them, and promised to do better next time. This interview is gut-wrenching to watch, especially now that we know that for Toby and Jaehong, the support duo that had been terrorizing teams since 2016, this was probably their last professional game together, and they likely knew that. It was a sad ending to a season that, ultimately, we all know could have been a lot more. While Seoul's strategy of subbing players in and out all over the place depending on map, practice, or if Mercury was in retrograde was entertaining and seemed to throw most lower level teams for a loop, any team that was really good probably could have beaten the Dynasty no matter who they had in, and therein lies the problem. They were good, but never great, save for maybe the Stage 1 playoffs. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if Seoul had a designated starting 6 from the beginning and just stuck with it. Would it have worked better? It's also worth mentioning that with Jaehong moving forward to the Titans and Zunbo leaving the team, Lunatic Hai is effectively dead. A team that, in their prime, was the best in the whole game. It sucks to see them slowly get outclassed and break apart, but I hope that we as a community never forget their influence on this game. Though, even with all that, I can't help but look back at the season with some optimism. Maybe it's just because we as a community had adjusted our expectations, but the Dynasty were a solid team for most of the season. They finally broke their playoff curse. In fact, they actually qualified for 3 of the 4 playoff brackets of the season and got their first playoff win, which is something not many teams can boast. What's really important is if the Dynasty continue to build on this momentum, or if they crash and burn in Season 3. But for the first time in a while, the Seoul Dynasty Tiger has some bite. That's why my final grade for the Seoul Dynasty in Season 2 of the Overwatch League is a B. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed looking back at the Seoul Dynasty season as much as I did. What do you think of Seoul's carousel roster strategy? And what do you think of their roster going into Season 3? They've got some big names in there. Let me know in the comments. As always, if you liked this video, leave a like, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet with notifications on so you don't miss an episode of SiR. Now let's see who we'll be looking at next. The LA Valiant. What a weird but fascinating story. I can't wait to tell it to you. Until then though, don't get tilted.